This lecture concludes our series in class on methodology and critical theory. Today we look back and reflect on, in an epilogue, what happens after theory. Now, after theory comes from a conference in 2003 called Life After Theory, which had the subtitle, Is There Life After Theory? And of course, there was no answer to be provided, merely to provoke questions. In attendance, you had Derrida, Kermode, Moi, and Norris, who were going to be discussing the various transitions we'd seen since the 1990s in critical theory. We find that also in the same year, Terry Eagleton is going to write After Theory and is going to address many of these same themes. Now, first, we need to address the term and what they mean by after. So specifically, they're not referring to a period that we now live in where theory no longer exists. On the other hand, we are talking about a period in the 2000s to the present where theory ceases to be something that is confrontational, controversial, or news. That theory, all of critical theory that we have discussed, has settled into general acceptance in these key ideas, or routinized. We understand and no one would disagree with the majority of the perspectives we've discussed. Therefore, we've passed into the general stream of ideas where the preaching phase is over. We have convinced, once again, people across various disciplines that these are valuable insights and valuable perspectives. So what happens now? Throughout the majority of the 20th century, but especially from the 1970s and 80s, we see the development of multiple perspectives and key ideas, from formalism to cultural studies, as we have discussed in this class. And many of these ideas can be crystallized and or defined in four specific categories that are the most pressing now, that most scholars and researchers in the field agree upon. Number one, that identity is shifting instead of fixed, that we are prone, when understanding identity, to drifting. And this notion of being, whether you're talking about a sexuality, a gender, a nationality, is always going to be shifting and becoming instead of being stable. So this leads us to transnational concerns as well, and transhumanism. Secondly, we have cultural products being unstable, whether that be a film, a work of art, an advertisement, a social media post, that we do not have one stable meaning that is anchored at any given time. But instead, each is subject to shifting with the perceptions, with these various identities and for different groups. So in other words, one group will look at one cultural product, art, work of literature, film, etc., and interpret it entirely differently than another one because of their agendas and or how they identify with the world. Thirdly, we find that the instabilities of language exist in language itself, that we have this idea that no matter how concrete we believe and how clear we are being in the most prosaic form of communication, that through post-Freudian slippage and dream life or metaphor figuration, that these will always disrupt meaning, that it is never concrete and stable, something that everyone has agreed upon since post-structuralism and deconstruction. Finally, fourthly, we would state that we have this pervasiveness of theory, that it is not possible not to have a theoretical perspective. So we cannot take a neutral stance and just state that something exists. Every time we try to interpret it or talk about it, no matter what it is, we are taking a politically charged stance and a perspective that has many implications that go along with it. With these four key ideas of critical theory in mind, we now turn to how we have major shifts after theory, that being after the 1990s in the new millennium. And there are four basic points to think about here with these shifts or settlements, as they're often called. Number one, that theory now is more empirical. Instead of merely making a sweeping statement that would be backed up by a particular critical theory, now you find find it more common that we must demonstrate something rather than assert it. How can we prove something to be true rather than theoretically argue that it is possible? Secondly, we find that we are turning away from dominant materialism, hence these approaches like new historicism that cut out any past research knowledge and then need to be contextualized more. Thirdly, we are going to be shifting away from the linguistic sublime, or this notion that language, as structuralists believed, constructs and forms our entire world. As many more recent theorists have argued, if we are to take this idea at its face value, it allows us to deny the responsibility of our own words and what effect they might have, because they can be interpreted in any number of ways based upon how the individual constructs language. And fourthly, we find that we're shifting towards this new cultural critique, that this global pessimism takes hold after 9/11, with religious fundamentalism and environmental deterioration threatening the planet. We have a new, what is called crisis critique, that uses moral, religious, and ethical issues, bringing them to the forefront, stating that traditional critical theory is a luxury. We need to think about what is pressing and what is going to be weighing on us at this given moment. How are things going to be made better, and how do we understand them through more direct interpretation? Now, there are a few new perspectives that we should consider before concluding our class. One is known as Presentism. So Presentism, as the title suggests, is focusing on the present. In other words, what is the present meaning of a particular work we're investigating instead of its historical meaning? Now, this approach is going to evolve after the millennium, around the year 2000, and is going to be foregrounded by Hawkes, Grady, and Fernie, with critical presentism, as they call it, whereby we're reacting against history-centered approaches to cultural interpretation, stating that it's actually impossible to place ourselves in an historical past. We can never fully take ourselves out of our present and put ourselves in another perspective. We discuss that with deconstruction and post-structuralism, as well as new historicism and also post-colonialism. So we find that the argument here with presentists is going to be that we are going to always be going through this never-ending historical archaeology, always trying to reconstruct what something was, and it's impossible, they would argue. Instead, they would say they do not wish to speak with the dead, but rather they want to speak with the living. What do these works mean to people living today? And that's much more tangible, they would state. We can see, what does Shakespeare mean to people now? What does, once again, the poetry of Oscar Wilde or Pablo Picasso or Michelangelo? What does Plato and Aristotle mean to people now, as opposed to 5th and 4th century Greece? Another approach which is significant is new aestheticism, which, as the term suggests, revives aestheticism and appreciates the dialogue with a particular work instead of mastery over it. Again, this is going to emerge in the millennium and asks us to focus not on the context, but instead argues for the liberation of a particular work or cultural product, and it being viewed for its own sake. So this is going to show that the work is a part of an ongoing debate rather than ever having a fixed position. So we find that every treatment we have on a given cultural product is not the final word. If it were, then we would not have new publications, new investigations would not be sought, and nothing new would ever be written. Now, critical theory here is going to deny the autonomy of art and literature, as they would argue, always placing the external social psychic forces in the forefront instead of giving the work and the author its autonomy to be interpreted the way in which they intended. So obviously, it would always have a psychological interpretation or a post-colonial assertion or a formalist interpretation. So Ricoeur is going to write about this in his so-called hermeneutics of suspicion, whereby he states that in critical theory, we are distrustful of these cultural creators, artists, writers, filmmakers, because we don't believe that they actually are telling us what they mean. And we know better. We know what they actually meant because we can deconstruct them using these tools. So they find this to be a rather unfair analysis, instead believing that all works are different and therefore should be approached just as aestheticians like Kant and Hegel intended. Now, the argument actually goes back to Algernon Swinburne in the 19th century, who is a poet and critic and a friend of the pre-Raphaelite artist Rossetti. So he is going to admire Baudelaire and Gautier. These individuals advocated l'art pour l'art, or art for art's sake, as would be revived with new aestheticians. So the role of art in this instance is not to moralize and instruct, nor is it supposed to entertain someone. The purpose is art itself. And so the argument here, if we're appealing to the senses with the aesthetic movement, now we have the new aesthetic movement, would be that we should appreciate something that we are watching, reading, or listening to for its own cultural purposes and its aesthetic appeal, not trying to understand its didactic intent and or its cultural functions or associations. Now, one of the most recent and controversial critical theoretical approaches is known as posthumanism, which is also associated with transhumanism. Now, this is the move beyond humanism that questions the universal state of experience of all humans. So humanism, which can trace its roots back to classical antiquity, revived in the Renaissance, is going to state that there is a universal and quintessential experience that all humans have, and that being human is something that we can all understand with our ethical values, our beliefs, and our experiences. Posthumanism questions that because, in fact, there is no such thing as a quintessential humanism. So we find that posthumanism will argue, and posthumanists will, that we are not autonomous and rational, capable of free will, and we are not unified and an apex of the existence of the planet. So we are not the be-all, end-all species. It rejects this notion that man, capital M, in traditional humanism, is the universal representative of all humans, especially since in humanism we find that man, capital M, is generally going to be a Eurocentric white heterosexual male. Now, we find that posthumanism recognizes the imperfectibility, we cannot be perfect, in other words, of humans and of the human condition, and our disunity, specifically our heterogeneity, that we are different and we must consider our differences. So it accepts these differences fundamentally. And even more so, just like we discussed with postmodernism and pluralism, which is going to be how humanism evolves from critical theory, we find that the fluidity of changing perspectives and shifts between identities is going to fall in line with those four main critical theory components that we discussed. That identity is always shifting. The difference being with posthumans, they believe you can occupy multiple identities at the same time. Now, what is going to be the driving force behind posthumanism? And much like we talked about a moment ago with the concern over global catastrophe and impending doom, it is these global catastrophes and clashing religious ideologies that we see that are rising after 9/11. And so posthumanists believe we must contend with the various and myriad ethical considerations to meet these challenges, both in a geopolitical fashion and also an environmental fashion. So we can think of eco-theory as well in this instance. With posthumanism, we conclude our course in research methods, and for some final thoughts, ask you to reflect and look back on the different perspectives we covered over the course of this class in the last 15 weeks. From formalism, moving through structuralism, through post-structuralism to cultural studies, we find that these various perspectives provide you with the ability to look at your own disciplines through various lenses, through other people's eyes, eyes and to see things you might have previously overlooked, to find something undiscovered, and provide you with a new approach to your own work, whether that be teaching, research, production, performance, all of which can be viewed in all of these ways. Now, will all of these be equally relevant to your specific field? No. Are you to be an expert in all of these given critical strategies and methodologies at this point? No. But you should have received enough overview of each one of them to use them as a tool in the future, to investigate them further, should you find them to be intriguing, useful, and once again, a good way in which for you to be innovative and dig more deeply into your specific field and topic. It has been my pleasure going over all of these with you this term, and I look forward to reading all of your final papers and how you apply them to your given fields.